Please welcome Melissa Chen and Professor Pinker.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's really heartening to see, all the faces in the room. I remember when FAIR was just an idea, and it's, maybe that was around January, and the official launch was March, and now we're almost up to 70 chapters in the country, and just to see all the faces here, parents and concerned citizens just, gathering and organizing it's really nice to see. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Pinker for coming back to Boston. He's on sabbatical in Berkeley this time of the year, so thank you.
Thank you.
I really want to get into your book. Of course, the first question is always, why? Like, how do you define rationality?
If you look up rationality in a dictionary, it's not particularly helpful because it's usually defined as the use of reason, but reason and rationality actually come from the same Latin root, so the definition is somewhat circular. I found that a pretty serviceable definition is the use of knowledge to attain goals. Rationality always is in pursuit of a goal. Just spouting true statements is not anyone's idea of rationality. If you take a logic course, you know that you could easily churn out an infinite number of true statements. If 2 + 2 = 3, then pigs can fly. That's true. You could do that forever, and no one would call that rational. So it can't just be truth. We usually think of rationality as the use of alternative means to attain a goal. And I work in William James Hall. I've cited William James in almost all of my books, and I love William James' characterization of rationality. He contrasted, he noted a similarity, that Romeo wants Juliet as the filings want the magnet. But he also noted that if a wall be built between Romeo and Juliet, they don't press their faces idiotically against opposite sides like the magnet and filings with the card. Romeo finds a circuitous way by scaling the wall or going around the wall of touching Juliet's lips directly. The goal is fixed, but the means can be varied indefinitely, whereas with a mechanical process that we don't consider rational, the path is fixed, and whether it reaches the end just depends on accidents or coincidences. So that's how I characterize it, and it has the important implication that there can be the rational pursuit of, let's say, debatable goals, or even irrational goals. Why I wrote it was in part because, like many social scientists, I've long thought that there are tools of rationality that are not particularly intuitive, like logic, like probability theory, like Bayes' rule, like game theory, like correlation and causation, and that we'd all just be smarter if we had them at our fingertips. And they're not a standard part of our educational curriculum. And so I first taught a course, then decided at long last to write a book with tutorial introductions to what I consider the 5 or 6 major tools of rationality. But inevitably, when I told people first I was teaching a course in the gen ed curriculum at Harvard, then a book, the first question is, oh great, you're going to be talking about rationality. Maybe you can explain why humanity is losing its mind. Why the fake news and the conspiracy theories and the paranormal woo-woo and the quack cures and the post-truth rhetoric and perhaps even the critical race theory.
So, that's something that I wanted to ask also was, if you think of like humankind as a whole, that analogy that if everything was condensed to the scale of 24 hours, the Big Bang Theory, all the way to where we are now, humans only existed for that last second. But within that last second, when did rationality, like how did it evolve? Like when was the first time, or it was codified into the institutions, or entered kind of the public consciousness and became a way of organizing life, modern life?
Yeah, no, I think that's a deep and very pertinent question. And I think there are 2 kinds of rationality that I distinguish in the book, and this very much speaks to the question of how can one species be so rational as to have discovered the Big Bang and how the brain works and DNA and reached the moon and smartphones and vaccines and all the rest, but at the same time believe that jet contrails are mind-altering drugs dispersed by a government program, or the American deep state houses a cabal of cannibalistic, Satan-worshipping pedophiles. In one sense, rationality really is kind of baked into our natures. We are Homo sapiens, the thinking hominid. We, right from the beginning, have lived by our wits, survived by entering what I semi-whimsically call the cognitive niche in nature, a term I actually borrowed, maybe stole from Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, and Irv DeVore. This is the idea that we are obviously products of evolution, but many species have weird, unusual, flamboyant adaptations. The elephant's trunk, the bat sonar. Ours is developing mental models of how the world works, pooling our understanding with language, cooperating with non-relatives, all of which are zoologically unusual. We really are a weird species of mammal. But we developed these abilities so that we could kind of outsmart other animals and plants faster than they could evolve defenses in evolutionary time. We can do it in our lifetimes. We do it in our heads. We don't have to wait for evolution to breed variations and selectively winnow them out. We can think ahead, develop traps and tools and poisons, and track animals based on their footprints and other spoor. And that means that we could live in any ecosystem, from the Arctic to the rainforest to the savanna. So that is part of human nature, and I begin the book with a discussion of the rationality of the San people of the Kalahari Desert, formerly called the Bushmen, and how they use considerable ingenuity and indeed considerable rationality to scratch a living out of a pretty unforgiving desert. But then, way more recently, so the answer to that would be however old our species is, say 200,000 years. Then, way more recently, we have developed general purpose abstract tools that are not kind of mixed in with our subject matter knowledge, how do antelopes behave, how do gourds store water, which beetles have poison, but are across the board tools. P implies Q, P therefore Q, logic. Bayes' rule, you can plug in any values you want. These had to be developed. Maybe Aristotle with the laws of logic might have been an early attempt. Probability theory only really invented in the 18th century. We have an intuitive sense of probability, but it's mixed in with our experience. It's not a general purpose formula. So these formulas are much more recent. Some of them are more recent still, like game theory and expected utility theory, the late 1940s, von Neumann and Morgenstern. And those are, if you were taking your, what was it, a day? This would be the fraction of a second that we've developed those. And those are not part of our birthright. Those we have to consciously learn in school.
But it sounds to me that how you frame the goal is a very normative thing. And, you in the book, you go through a laundry list of cognitive illusions, biases, and fallacies. And I'm wondering, there is in this like woke worldview that, to use the common parlance, I'm not a fan of the word woke, but we don't really have another choice now, in which there is a constellation of ideas that seem to be in vogue, especially among cultural elites in education, but also, it's also in vogue in media, just other verticals in society. Things like the idea that systematic racism permeates animates every single institution and person, critical race theory, the denial of biological sex, whiteness, ideas like defund the police, replacing, for example, advanced classes, which is happening in some schools now. And as you said in your last book, the denial of progress, that progressives tend to deny progress. These are a suite of ideas that we could kind of, classify as under the woke doctrine that we recognize today. And I'm wondering how your fallacies and list, are these rational? Are these ideas, are they using knowledge to advance a goal, or is this more of or is it based on theory and not empiricism?
Yeah, I think that there's some of each. I mean, anything, it's a part of rationality that any proposition may be criticized, debated. So if I argue that there's been a decline in violence based on, say, homicide statistics, estimates of war deaths, then one could rationally argue back and say, well, given that we have the possibility of nuclear war, which would dwarf all previous wars, even though one hasn't occurred, if it occurred, it would cancel out all those beneficial statistics. So how is it fair to say that violence has declined given the potential has increased? One could rationally contest any of the data sets. Are they truly unbiased? So there are, I don't want to say that anyone who disagrees with me is irrational, because that would be the height of irrationality. So yes, anything can be debated. But but I think a lot of us do have a sense that somehow the rules have changed in a lot of these debates, or maybe not even debates, of these clashes, the culture war, as it's sometimes called, and the metaphor is illuminating, not the culture debate, but the culture war. For one thing, there are a number of classic fallacies, errors, blunders in critical thinking that now have become kind of coin of the realm, like arguing ad hominem, so-and-so is a racist, therefore you can't believe what they, or can't accept what they say. Unfalsifiability, if you oppose the idea that all differences are due to racism, then that shows that you are a racist. Kind of a built like a family of beliefs like God works in mysterious ways, or ESP disappears whenever it's skeptically probed. Kind of ideas that inherently make themselves resistant to falsification, and therefore there's a kind of irrationality baked into them. Other fallacies like guilt by association, that if you, arguments from authority, so-and-so's, Ibram Kendi says it, critical race theory says it, therefore it must be true. So there are the fallacies that used to be considered kind of forehead-slapping blunders that high school debating coaches would say, no, you can't make that argument, that's a fallacy. Or just dirty, rotten tricks, like if someone were to try it, that would kind of impugn themselves as an honest debater. And now they in this whole space, they have become kind of the coin of the realm.
I do actually want to read to you a quote. When Dr. Ibram Kendi was asked to define racism at a conference recently, he actually said, "I define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas." That was his definition of racism.
3 times, around the circle 3 times, yes. Well, there is a part there that's, well, it can be either circular or a testable hypothesis, which is that all inequities, racial inequities, are due to racism. Now, of course, if you define racism as he does as racial inequities, then it is circular. If you define it as...
It's like rationality and reason.
Yeah, exactly, right. If, on the other hand, you give it some independent definition, such as classic white supremacy, the explicit belief that it is desirable that whites have undue influence, what my late colleague Jim Sidanius called social dominance orientation, the belief that it is desirable that some groups have power over others, some sort of animus against African Americans, then it is a testable hypothesis that all racial inequities are due to racism in the sense of animus. However, I think Kendi himself resists that framing and instead defines racism circularly as any difference between races.
Well, I think many parents have expressed this, that that rationality is actually demoted now in K-12 schools. In fact, I the first time I ever heard it taught as a course was when you did it at Harvard just last spring semester. But instead, the approach to pedagogy now in K-12 has been more through using theory as a way of establishing truth, and frameworks derived from ideas that had trickled down from Harvard Law School that were once very obscure. And so I'm wondering what your reflections are on this issue. Like, what do you think about what's happening in K-12 education?
Yeah, it is. So I think a lot of us would subscribe to the idea that you have noted that a lot of schools are moving away from, namely that we should first establish what the facts are and then kind of shape our moral and political beliefs around them. That is I think that's a post-Enlightenment conviction. I mean, I think Bertrand Russell said it succinctly when he said, "It's undesirable to believe a proposition when there are no grounds whatsoever for supposing it is true." Now, that might sound kind of banal and obvious and trite and like, who could disagree with that? In fact, it is a deeply radical manifesto, because for most of human history, people did not start off with their most objective assessment of the facts and then tailor their theories to be consistent with it, but quite the other way around. They'd have moral convictions, and facts are, at least outside of the realm of their physical interactions with the world, where you really do have to respect the facts because they won't go away if you don't believe in them. But when it comes to anything that is more cosmic, more abstract, more sociological, more remote, that don't impinge on your day-to-day decisions, there people kind of start off with ideology and then promote facts that are consistent with it. An extreme example being, I think, outlandish fake news and conspiracy theories, where we kind of slap our heads or scratch our heads and wonder, could anyone really believe that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of a pizzeria in D.C.? But you've got to realize that people who hold that belief don't, I think for the most part, don't hold it as a belief like there's gas in the car or food in the fridge where you really ought to find out. It's really another way of saying, boo, Hillary. Namely, she is so depraved that that's the kind of thing she could be capable of. And that's, I think, a lot of our psychology of belief, at least when it comes to the zone of ideas that don't impinge on our day-to-day well-being. Beliefs are expressive. They're even beliefs that are technically factual or propositional. And likewise, going back to the non-circular definition of racism, is it really true that all racial differences are due to racism in the sense of animus or social dominance? It's not a fact that anyone has an interest in verifying. It's just something that you say is part of a moral conviction. And there's a family of beliefs like that, like religious belief. They're held as a matter of faith, almost by definition. And when Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens published their atheist manifestos, a lot of the reaction wasn't, oh, they're factually mistaken. Actually, there really are good reasons to believe that God exists. But rather, it's just uncouth or inappropriate or just not done to consider God's existence a matter of truth or falsity. You believe it because it's a good thing to believe, not because it's factually correct. I think this is bad for religion. I think it's bad for political movements. I think it's especially bad for education, that it really was a gift of the Enlightenment that there are facts. None of us knows when we know them for certain. None of us is infallible or omniscient. We're all too fallible. That's why ideas have to be broached and evaluated. But we really ought to find out what the facts are. And to abandon that in service of this ideology, I think is a grave mistake, because it leads to war. That is, neither side has common ground on which they can build some kind of constructive disagreement or agreement.
And I will say the definition of racism has also changed. So it used to be, prejudice based on racial characteristics. Now they have changed the definition to include power. There's power part of the formula. And it has been adopted by a certain section of society that peddles this also, or takes it as a given. And so one of the most ridiculous consequences of this is now seeing in admissions people of color minus Asians or something like that, because
not that color.
Right, but this is one of those consequences of that belief that power is baked into racism, to the point that a person of color now cannot be guilty of racism, and we see a whole suite of consequences to believing that idea that is very dangerous for society.
Well, indeed. I mean, for one thing, it is just incoherent. The idea that you can't have racial animus if you are a particular color. It's a perfect instance of one of the propositions that I think that FAIR has identified as something that it is opposed to, namely racial essentialism. The idea that based on your race, there are certain beliefs that you just have to hold. Kind of, you'd think on the face of it, pretty insulting, I dare say racist, when it comes to all of the hundreds of thousands, the millions of African Americans who don't happen to believe the belief that's attributed to them, and it's absurd to think that they would. If you're not a racist, it means that everyone has a mind, is sentient and capable of reason, and to hold that all members of a race have a particular belief is just so shockingly patronizing that it denies an agency. It's surprised that it isn't kind of laughed out of the room. But it also, aside from the fact that it is incoherent, it is essentializing, but of course it also is guaranteed to make enemies out of people who don't like being called racist when they're not. And I hate to say, that's what gave us Donald Trump, but in part, that's what gave us Donald Trump. There are a lot of people who are sick of being called racist or even called privileged or powerful, given that they're not, and the people who are calling them that are, like people in the media, like people in academia, like people who actually do have power, claiming that a lot of white people, working class people, rural people who don't have power, claiming that they are personally oppressors. Again, guilt by collective guilt being another one of the propositions that FAIR is dedicated to combating.
So in chapter 2, you wrote about forbidden base rates and the just thinking about taboo trade-offs and how that's perceived as sort of morally corrosive. It seems to me that, academic culture in general has reached a point where we are unable to think about taboo trade-offs. People have been canceled for doing so, and students are afraid to speak out in class, and professors too. How do you think that academic culture can change?
Yeah, not easy. So this is an allusion to a theory by the psychologist Philip Tetlock on the presence of taboo in all of us. It's not a ritual of Polynesian South Sea Islanders, which is where the word came from. But there are certain thoughts that we deem immoral to think. You might say, well, that's impossible. It's only deeds that can be immoral. But he notes that in our interpersonal relationships, we judge people not only by what they do, but who they are, what they're capable of. If someone had said, for how much would you sell your child, or sexual favors, or your vote, the answer would not be, well, what are you offering? The answer would be, I'm offended that you would ask. It would never occur to me. I'm offended by the very question. because we deem some of our relationships to be sacred, our relationships with our family, our spouse, our country, and we don't trade them off. We don't even think about trading them off. And there is a certain rationality to that when it comes to our everyday social interactions, who we befriend, who we entrust. Because even if someone has treated us well so far, you don't want to constantly worry that you're going to get, stabbed in the back as soon as your back is turned or sold down the river. You want the people you deal with to be steadfast, to be the kind of people that wouldn't even think about betraying you. So there's a kind of logic to it in our social interactions. The problem is that when we project our interpersonal relationships to the public sphere and we have to make policy, that's when we can sometimes be Tetlock argues, handicapped or indeed crippled by these taboos. By the way, I have one of my current projects is a BBC radio and podcast series, which they call Think with Pinker. And one of the episodes, not yet released, only the first one was just released yesterday, actually. But in a couple of weeks, I have Phil Tetlock on this series, together with Sally Sattel. Some of you might be familiar with Sally, a psychiatrist and public intellectual, talking about one taboo trade-off, which is compensating organ donors. Now, one could make a hyper-libertarian argument that people should be allowed to sell organs for donation at will. You should be able to sell your kidneys on eBay. People who sold them would benefit financially. People who needed a kidney their lives would be transformed and no one would be worse off. Nonetheless, there is a real ick reaction to that idea, even to milder forms like compensating voluntary organ donors for the cost of surgery, which you cannot do, or putting some money aside for a college tuition fund or toward retirement or toward health insurance, should they ever need medical assistance. All of those, by the way, are felonies. Phil identifies compensated organ donation as one of a set of taboo trade-offs, such as selling your vote, selling your obligation to military service, which used to be perfectly acceptable during the Civil War. People would sell their obligations, buying your way out of jury duty, things that are now considered beyond the pale. A second kind of secular taboo, Melissa also mentioned, this is the forbidden base rate. If you were, again, this ties into another tool of reasoning, namely Bayes' rule or Bayes' theorem, according to which you start off with a prior. The term prior has even crossed over from statistics into everyday conversation. We talk about, those aren't my priors, namely your expectation before you even look at evidence. And a forbidden base rate would be looking up the rate of school success, of terrorism, of crime, of white-collar crime for, say, particular ethnic groups before considering an individual. Now, again, this is morally abhorrent, and there are reasons why it ought to be. Although if you were a good statistician, you would say, well, of course you factor in the base rates. That's Bayesian reasoning. But nonetheless, it makes the flesh crawl when you think about, say, judging a criminal defendant based on the overall statistics of their religion or sex or a racial group. And I think for some good reason. The third being the heretical counterfactual. That is, it's, even though counterfactual thinking, what would happen if the world were a little bit different, is part of rationality. That's what we mean by causation, namely, if things were different, then if the cause were absent, the effect would not have occurred. Nonetheless, there are certain counterfactuals where, as we say, you don't go there. Salman Rushdie was the subject of a fatwa for playing out a purely fictitious scenario about the life of Muhammad. And I gave an example of a real-life case of a heretical counterfactual. Some people I know were playing an after-dinner party game. They'd go around the table and say, well, of course, none of us is at least bit prejudiced or biased or bigoted. But let's just say, hypothetically, you were. which group would you be biased against? I don't advise playing this game. Someone that I know dumped her boyfriend after he said Jews. But it just shows that there are certain thoughts that we deem immoral to think, probably because they are giveaways to the what might be the awful truth. This is played out in fiction because it is so mind absorbing. Sophie's Choice, Indecent Proposal. There are other examples.
I just don't know why your head has to go to race immediately. If there was a group I had to subjugate, it would be, I don't know, people that put pineapple on pizzas or something. It's just, like, why is race the first?
You'd be very good at this game, yes. and I agree with you. I'm prejudiced against them as well.
But I'm glad you brought up Bayesian reasoning because, my view, and this is a personal view, of a lot of progressive thought where the West in particular is singled out as being the most patriarchal, the most oppressive place on the planet. And sometimes when there's evidence to the contrary, those priors are not updated. For example, recently, what happened to the tennis star Peng Shui, who disappeared after she had a Me Too complaint, a government official of sexual assault. And what happens there when you do that is she disappeared. Nobody has heard from her since she made those accusations. And comparing that to, for example, in the United States, where Me Too blossomed as a movement, and women were able to come out and talk about their past experiences. Harvey Weinstein is facing the consequences of his actions. And nobody has to worry, no woman has to worry about the state clamping down on them. And elsewhere around the world, that's not true. It's very difficult for the voiceless to have a voice. It's very difficult for the repressed to have any platform, really. And we have such a different, we have a different moral threshold. And sort of these stories don't seem to get factored in a way that makes people here who think this is the worst place on earth revise their priors and to think that we have not made any progress and that we need to dismantle everything. How do you convince them to do that?
That's such a profound point that yes, in cross-national surveys, whether they are just based on these blatant crimes, or on surveys, do show that the United States, as far as societies go, is not particularly prejudiced. I think the one that was most was the last survey that I saw was India, in terms of denial, people actually advocating the denial of rights to ethnic or religious or racial minorities. Now, this is not, of course, not to say that racism doesn't exist in the United States. Of course it does. But it is by no means the most racist society on earth. It's one of the less ones. Also, over time, there's many kinds of evidence that racism has declined. Again, the fact that it has declined does not mean that it is anywhere close to zero, and ideally it would be close to zero. But in both overt statements, like, do you think black and white children should go to separate schools? Would you move out if a black family moved in next door? Are you opposed to racial marriage? Do you think that African Americans are less capable or less motivated than whites? All of these, the curves plunge, and in some cases are kind of in the range of crank opinion, like the same number of people agree to it as agree to something like, I believe that Joe Biden is a lizard. So in that realm of crank opinion. And now you might say, well, of course, people don't confess to racism anymore, but that just means that there's a awareness of the social norm that you really oughtn't to say these things in public, but the covert implicit bias is as strong as ever. But that too is testable, and that too turns out not to be correct. My colleagues Mahzarin Banaji and Tessa Charlesworth, Mahzarin being one of the co-originators of the implicit association test, the controversial but widely discussed assay for implicit bias has shown that in the 20 years that she and her colleagues have been administering the test to hundreds of thousands of people who've taken it online, the amount of implicit bias, that is association of African American faces with negative words and concepts, has gone down. I've shown with Seth Stevens-Davidowitz looking at Google search data that search for racist jokes has gone down over the last 20 years. And when it comes to attitudes, say, towards interracial marriage, we don't have to look at attitudes. We can look at, quite literally, skin in the game, quite literally. How many people do marry people of other races? And the answer is a lot. And that has been increasing steadily for 50 years. So by a lot of measures, racism really has declined no matter how you measure it. And the United States is not the worst. Again, it shouldn't be such a feat of mental gymnastics to both believe that and to believe that racism still exists in the United States. But I find that it's surprisingly difficult to get people to acknowledge those two ideas.
There's some fallacy going on where simply acknowledging that fact means that you've lessened the significance or lessened something else, which, like you said, they should be independent.
Exactly.
All right, my next question for you is, so George Orwell once said that there are some ideas that are so stupid that only intellectuals believe them. How can we explain the appeal of wokeness despite its track record and apparent historical inaccuracies among elites and very highly educated people?
Yeah, no, it's another profound question, and I've given a lot of thought to it, and I don't have a definitive answer, but I've kind of looked around for possible explanations. So one of them is that it is certainly deeply rooted intellectually in the Western intellectual tradition, going back to probably the Frankfurt School, the originators of what's called critical theory, not to be confused with critical thinking, of which critical race theory is a variety. And it is a lot of people object to the notion of cultural Marxism, and that it is something of a simplification, but the Frankfurt School kind of carried over the idea that history is a struggle between groups, a zero-sum struggle for power, substituting for economic classes, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, and so on, races, genders, and sexual orientations. But it's group against group power struggle as the basic driver of history and the basic explanation for social phenomena. And that's been around the Frankfurt School was literally the 1920s, and so it's almost a century. And as Andrew Sullivan pointed out, we all live on campus now. Ideas that start off as influential in the academy spill over as graduates take over positions of power in institutions. So another kind of piece of the puzzle is that there is a phenomenon called Conquest's second law, after the historian Robert Conquest, that any institution that is not constitutionally right-wing becomes left-wing. And we see this in newspapers and nonprofits and charities and foundations. And again, it's an interesting question why that should seem to be a kind of tectonic trend. A third possibility, again, none of these are mutually exclusive, but with the legitimate value that we ought to oppose racism, that can have some perverse consequences. One of them is, how do you know how much you should oppose racism? Well, if you follow the heuristic, always be a little bit less racist than the people around you. Well, if the people around you they've abandoned white supremacy and they have no problem with interracial marriage and they really believe that we're all equal, and you're trying to be even less racist than them, well, now you're going to start to object to Halloween costumes and
Cultural appropriation.
And what, pardon?
Cultural appropriation.
Cultural appropriation, exactly. And so there can be a kind of escalator, a virtue signaling escalator, if the rule is, whatever the level is, always try to be less racist than that. And it can spiral into absurdity. This Scott Alexander offered this speculation. Another one is that, this is from Richard Hanania, that there's a sense in which wokeness or critical race theory is kind of built into civil rights law. that going back to the 1960s, there has been the commitment that any racial disparity is a sign of discrimination, or at least the burden of proof is on employers to show that if there is a racial discrepancy, that they are not racist. And so for Coca-Cola and General Motors and all the rest to go woke, it's actually not that surprising, considering that it gives them a pretty good defense against a discrimination lawsuit. They say, well, we've got anti-racist training. We're not, don't look at our hiring statistics to sue us for racism. We're as anti-racist as it gets. Finally, one other dynamic, and I'm sorry for having maybe too many explanations, but we don't really know which ones are right or in what combination. Another is there's and again, the fact that there is so much agreement that racism is a bad thing, and racism is a bad thing, it opens communities up to a dynamic in which and this is an idea I partly took from my former postdoc, now a professor of political science at SUNY Stony Brook, that there's an inherent human desire to not be on the losing side of a conflict between groups, between one coalition and another. You really do want to be in the majority. You don't want to be the target of the wrong side of group against group coalition. Groups are dynamic. They can form on many kinds of bases, another insight from social psychology. And one good way of forming a group in which a majority can coalesce is by identifying some salient sin or crime in a minority. Even in an individual, you get together and you all hate on one victim. Something that everyone can agree on pretty easily. Once it begins, you really don't want to be on the bad side. You want to be on the side of the angels. And I think some of us might remember, even in the playground, as a kind of bullying group starts to coalesce, or even a shaming group or a mean girls group, there's an anxiety. Even if you think that it's unfair, you don't want to be on the target side. You want to be on the bully side. And that can especially take root based on simulations and experiments by Michael Macy at Cornell. When ideally to show your allegiance to a group, since once a group becomes powerful, everyone wants to join it. Everyone wants to be a fair weather friend. How do you prove that you're a true believer, that you're really committed? Well, if you're not only willing to defend the group, but you're willing to condemn the heretics, the miscreants, the defectors, that's a kind of honest signal of your commitment to the group. And you can get people to coalesce sometimes around absurd beliefs, simply by the dynamic of preemptively accusing lest you be the one who's accused. And I think we're seeing some of the feeling that there is a kind of bullying dynamic going on. And intimidation might be a part of that dynamic of dynamic coalition formation around some imputed sin of someone else.
I want to ask the last question before I open it up to whoever. We'll do like 15 minutes of Q&A. So if anyone wants to step forward, I'll hand you my mic. But you mentioned that persuasion only works if your ideological opponent abides by and respects the concept of rationality. And in part, I think it's been very difficult for many parents here who want to speak up about issues. They're afraid that they're going to get canceled. That what they're going to get in return is not a rational argument. What do you have any words for them? How do you deal with another side that will treat them that way?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question, and I don't want to say that I have kind of empirically tested tactics, and I don't want to recommend something that could lead someone to be canceled. But here I'll throw out some ideas. One of them is that in this kind of regime of intimidation into silence, there is the role for the boy who says the emperor is naked. often telling people something that they knew all along, but they didn't know that everyone else knew that everyone else knew it, the phenomenon of common knowledge. Common knowledge being the technical term for not just knowing something, but knowing that everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows it. It's recursive, exactly. It's recursive mentalizing. And that can, the kind of spiral of silence where no one speaks out because of the intimidation can be broken when people hear some view that they all along they've wondered, gee, am I crazy or is the whole world crazy? Maybe I'm crazy. And then when it is voiced, they say, no, I guess I'm not crazy. So there's just that, the sheer courage of being the little boy. There are the built-in, kind of the built-in advantages that FAIR has, such as avoiding really racism, saying all black people think alike. It's the opposition to the critical race theory that gets to say that. No, all black people don't think alike. Or collective guilt. Slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and so on and lynching were horrible things, but none of the people in this room did it, and it is wicked to punish someone for something that they themselves didn't do just because people with the same skin color as them did it. That's kind of a built-in advantage, and it's hard to refute. Again, unless people have been intimidated into a spiral of silence that you're not allowed to doubt that truism. And I think there ought to be, these aren't even really concessions, like who is could possibly be opposed to the idea of teaching some of many of the ugly incidents of racism in American history. I mean, there's no one who's saying slavery should not be taught, or lynching, or the Ku Klux Klan, or Jim Crow, or the various anti-black pogroms like the Tulsa riot. One should advocate, that's part of American history. It really should be taught, and I'd be surprised if anyone thinks that they shouldn't. So certainly not to concede the high ground, because one of the bogus arguments for critical race theory is, so you're saying we shouldn't teach kids about the history of racism? Well, of course we should. I mean, so to be up front, own that issue, and to say, we're the first to say that should be part of American history, as should the various crimes and atrocities against Native Americans. Those did happen. We really ought to teach them, but of course in a suitably balanced context.
I guess to conclude, I would say, thank you so much for writing the book. I learned a lot from it, and I hope that this is something that will be taught in K-12 schools. I know you taught it at Harvard the last semester, but this should, instead of, there's a whole bunch of things that I think are very fundamental to allow kids to grow up to be meaningful citizens, to participate in the democratic process, to think about policies. And I'd love for our kids to be able to learn about all of this from a very systematic way. And I think that's what Stephen's book is about. So it's available at all bookstores, anywhere. I'd like to get some of you asking him questions, because it's rare to be able to get Dr. Pinker's views on things directly. So if anyone has questions, we'll do 15 minutes. It's 8:05 now, and I'll time it. So come up, and I'll hand you the microphone so that everyone can hear.
And I just want to thank you, Melissa, for those very deep and profound questions. Thanks. It's been a privilege to be up here on stage with you.
So one thing that I think people are hearing around here is not just the racism issue, it's the trans issue. And when those questions come up, where people go to is, you're denying my child a life. That's really hard to come back at. So while I might be able to come back at the racism and say, we can all agree, the minute somebody throws this into a conversation of, you want my child to die, that's where it ends. You're like, I can't even come back. So I didn't know if you had any ideas on that.
Yeah, again, that's a very painful situation that parents have been put into. Do you want a trans son or a dead daughter, as it's rather tastelessly and unfairly put? It's I don't know if I have tactical advice on how to reply. I mean, the facts are that although there is somewhat elevated risk of depression and suicide for kids who transition or want to transition, it's not clear that it's gender dysphoria per se, that it may be that when a young person is suffering from these stresses and depressions, that especially recently, the transitioning appeals to that set of young people as a radical way out of a situation that, for whatever reason, they find unhappy. But I don't know, tactically, what is the suitable comeback to that rather ugly accusation?
So I'm a high school English teacher, and I feel like I came in at a certain time in my career where my mentors, many of whom were very progressive, were classically liberal in their approach to teaching. And they taught me how to say, well, what's this side? What's that side? What's the middle? What are the middle things? And to never let my students truly know exactly what I thought, or if I did, I would step aside and say, well, let me say, I'm talking as myself over here. The Socratic Method, okay? Why is it so hard to use that as one of our central tactics, to get back to that, what I call the classically liberal technique of teaching, no matter what the subject matter is? I mean, do you think that is something that FAIR itself, I feel like FAIR stands for that, but what can we do to sort of bring that back into play?
Yeah, sort of as a matter of practical advice, I'm reluctant to offer an answer, particularly since I am personally removed from the context of schools and the somewhat strange regime that has just so suddenly descended on the schools, where the principles that you just articulated, which are, should be golden, and that's just should be self-evidently the way that a responsible teacher teaches. And then that all of a sudden that is considered to be a subversive doctrine. It's happened so quickly, I think it's taken a lot of us by surprise. And other than articulating that and having some kind of posse, of a backup, of someone with your back, such as FAIR, so that it isn't just you, I'm just not sure what will be effective at turning back this tide, but certainly just making that case as a start.
I worry it's actually a culture thing, because everything is politicized now, like the goods you consume, sports. And so we have very little spaces left that aren't. I remember volunteering in actually Boston Public Schools. I taught like second or third grade once. And the kid asked me all of a sudden, just out of the blue, I was there talking about science writing. And he just asked me, do you believe in God? And he was like this little black kid. And I just looked at him and I was like, I'm an atheist, but I would never say my own belief. And so I just started asking him a bunch of questions. I was like, well, what do you think about this? How do you think? And I think that is really lost today. It's when everything is politicized around you, and it's actually a cultural change that needs to happen before we can even get teachers back onto that track of neutrality.
Thank you. So I have a professor, I did, about 5 years ago. I was in college, and she was pretty woke, and she was probably one of the only woke ones at the school. And she did teach, other things outside of just, I guess, woke ideas. But I've been thinking, as I've kind of come out of it, I've, lived a little life and realized, these ideas aren't really even practical, much less true. And I thought I could write a letter to the president, or I could write her a letter, or I could just let it play out because I have concerns. She actually taught us about logical fallacies, and then proceeded to teach us about the patriarchy and how, it will influence every single thing that happens to me in my future. And so I thought, is this a dangerous professor? I don't want to cancel her. So what would you advise as an approach for me, just as, a single student kind of worried about her current students? She does still teach there, and I really liked her. I was really, enthralled by her, and that's what a professor should do. But, at the same time, I don't want to ruin anyone's life or anything like that. So ideas on that, and perhaps that question, you could also answer for me.
Thank you. Go ahead. That's a hard one.
So I don't know if anyone has been canceled for being too woke. So certainly, I don't think you're jeopardizing her in that way.
Nicole Hannah Jones would say otherwise. She would say she got canceled.
Okay, canceled in the sense of being permanently unemployable, as opposed to having not getting one particular position. But you might be that might be a good case. But I don't think that's what you're suggesting, right? I mean, you're not suggesting that she be fired, or you're just actually suggesting opening up a dialogue and maybe politely challenging her on some of her beliefs. Is that what you're suggesting?
I suppose so, yeah. I don't even know how to approach it, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of Socratic questioning is, a way of broaching the issue, and it may just be that the door gets slammed in your face, and that sometimes some people are so far gone that you can't even open up a dialogue. But there are ways of asking questions that at least get your foot in the door, and then you could probe. But again, and especially if you yourself are not threatening her. If it's just an exchange of ideas, then it's then there is no danger of her being canceled.
I think it sounds like, but what you were saying is that she was ineffective in the thing that she was supposedly teaching, right? So it's kind of like, I'm okay with a creationist teaching math, but not geology, right? So I think that's what it is. But
like committing logical fallacies while teaching logical fallacies,
Yeah, that was.
So.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly, it's always good to be tactful. You don't want to come up and accuse someone of something into their face. But if it's done Socratically, like maybe I'm not following, but doesn't this seem to contradict that? And there's no reason not to be polite and tactful.
Agreed.
Hi there. I'm involved in elementary education, and so I know that we're talking about the field of ideas and how we talk about ideas. But it's interesting about the idea of racism and what does that mean, racism. When you're talking about the little ones, I think of them as they're eating from the tree of, they're kind of eating from the tree of life, right? Developmentally. They're immersed, their attention is this lantern attention, and they're trying on all these possible selves. And I notice what's happening, and it's like you say, it's been hard and fast. And I'm seeing teachers and principals who are developmentalists. We're developmentalists, that's what we are. That's we see development as inextricably linked, and we say all these things, right? But all of a sudden something's come over our schools. And we have outside consultants that come into a faculty that has, where they pride themselves in their collegiality and in their developmental teaching. And all of a sudden we have fractured faculties that are doing affinity groups according to one dimension. Mm-hmm. And people who used to be developmentalists who say development is inextricably linked are now saying, okay, we're going to teach in first grade and second grade on the dimension, on the dimension of human beings as skin color. And now when we're at the play area, kindergarten and play school, these fabrics are off limits because they're not your culture's fabrics. These are on limits. This play is off limits because we don't have enough people of that color to do Lion King. And I'm talking, pretty prestigious schools in the area. And and even in the school my child is attending, that very thing, young person who said, but it wasn't me, and got into a heck of a lot of trouble for not owning the problem, right? So for me, it's less about the content, and I'm just curious to hear. This thing seems to be socially mediated, and it's going like a steamroller amongst people who are developmentalists, And so it's not just the ideas, it's like the things I thought we knew as educators in our bellies. We're putting kids who ate from the tree of life to now, oh, you're at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we're going to enforce it on you, and we're going to partition you according to, and it seems like, there's a lot of anxiety in schools. No shit, Sherlock. And I just love your thoughts on that, not the, the thinking part of it, but this developmental part of it.
Give me the child till he is 7.
Sorry, that was really long.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again, I don't want to claim that I understand either the rapid takeover or the most effective countermeasures. I think part of it, did you allude to the fact that there are people who are kind of brought in to implement these?
Yes, outside, it's
So-
supposed to be an industry, and there
follow
are
the money.
people.
So that is follow the money. I mean, that is, I do think that is part of the problem. And I even wondered, when, Melissa and I at different points in our career were at MIT, and or units affiliated with MIT. And for a while I thought, well, MIT not being being such a scientifically and technologically oriented institution, being open to data, not that being subject to fads originating in the humanities and English literature would be kind of immune to it. But no, MIT is as bad as the others, as we've just seen with the disinvitation of Dorian Abbott. And it's because deans and I suspect elementary and high school principals outsource some of their anti-racism training to these consultants that move kind of laterally from one school to another, are a kind of independent cadre. Their own livelihood depends on spreading this. It's convenient for administrators because they say, well, don't look at us, we're not racist, we hired an anti-racist consultant. And the anti-racist consultants make sure that there's kind of a full employment act for them if they train people to sniff out racism where people didn't think there was any racism, all the more need for their services. And there is a kind of professional entrenchment. So that is, I think, part of the problem, and it's rampant in universities where there is this entire profession of Title IX administrators and diversity, inclusion, and belonging administrators, and they get, when a school needs to hire one, they hire it from another school. And so very few schools even develop their own independent culture. It is, and for that reason, it's become nationwide with a few tiny exceptions in the university level. University of Chicago, Claremont McKenna College, but very few. Part of I tend to think, and again, I'm going to offer this tentatively, having no experience myself, that because some of this does involve this spiral of silence, or technical term is pluralistic ignorance, where everyone thinks they're the only one who believes it. It's like a classic study that in fraternities, no one actually thinks that binge drinking is a cool idea, but everyone mistakenly thinks that everyone else believes it. But it's like an emperor's new clothes phenomenon, that if everyone worries that they're the only one that thinks something and mistakenly thinks that everyone else thinks it, then being the first teller of the obvious can, at least in theory, cause the spiral to unravel. But it does help to be, if there's more than one little boy, that's better still. So, because in real life, what happens to little boys is not necessarily that everyone laughs in sympathy, but sometimes he's sent to the gulag.
I will say one of the things that we have is fair transparency. I don't know if you've heard about that. So you've seen whistleblowers have a huge impact, just like revealing documents, especially from these trainers. Like that's what happened at Coca-Cola when this blogger actually revealed like basically how to be less white or something. That was the title of the PowerPoint. And of course they were outraged, and so Coca-Cola had to reject that kind of training. And I think there are ways to anonymously do it. Fair transparency is kind of a glass door for civil liberties and these kinds of violations. You can anonymously report something. Somebody will get in touch with you. That's one way to do it if you still want to work there. But we've seen teachers recently, like Paul Rossi from Grace Church in New York, who very spectacularly resigned. He recorded conversations with the principal. And shockingly, some of that material is just knowing that the administrators know what they're doing to children and yet still are doing it was actually pretty shocking. But that creates, the kind of space for other people, and they'll come out to you, and you'll identify, that's kind of how the whole thing starts, I would say.
We're
and
doing
it's
it privately. I mean, it goes, quietly. It's going on like crazy.
right.
Little walks in the woods.
Right. Oh, gosh. Like so weird. You're all right. Then the next question.
You mentioned that both explicit and implicit racism, the studies show that it's been declining steadily over decades, and that's a good thing. Has there been, is there any measurement of any kind of backlash, I wonder, as this anti-racism, wokeism mounts? Does it, in fact, create in its backdraft its own form of return of racism? And is anybody studying that? And the other question I had was, you mentioned that this has all happened very suddenly in the schools, and I believe you're at Harvard. I mean, I don't think it's happened very suddenly at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I mean, I think this has been going on
that is true. Yeah.
Decades.
And is anybody doing anything about that? Those are two very separate questions.
Yeah. So in terms of the kind of post-George Floyd murder, sudden takeover of institutions by critical race theory, I don't know. It's happened so quickly that I don't know of any studies that have looked at signs of a backlash. But a lot of the work in the curiosity about the also somewhat precipitous rise of authoritarian populism of Donald Trump and similar movements in Europe suggests that some kind of backlash to kind of leftist takeover institutions might be a contributor, that people who vote for Trump are likely to say things like, well, these days you can't really say what you think, and the institutions are clamping down on free expression, and we're all considered deplorables, and I think there are strands of that in the analysis of the rise of Trumpian populism. In terms of, you're right that the roots of critical race theory and critical theory in general in academia are deep, but it does seem that the sudden, almost totalitarian takeover, where it's not just that it exists, but that any hint of a voicing of a demurral or of a reservation or opposition is itself grounds for punishment. That strikes me as more recent. Even though the ideas have been around, but the idea that if you were to criticize it, then you yourself would be branded as a racist and sometimes, fired. That seems to have come on pretty suddenly.
If someone is studying it, it might be someone like Wilfred Riley, who's at Kansas State. But my guess to your question is actually that I don't think there has been a physical backlash in terms of violence. As Stephen pointed out, the racial attitudes have actually all gone in one direction. The only area that I think we've seen a backlash to this is actually on affirmative action, where people in general, both the person who it benefits and the others who it doesn't, think that the person wasn't qualified to begin with. And that is the assumption of tokenism in general. When somebody is walking around in these schools that have affirmative action policies or companies that hire based on that, the assumption is that that person was there because of that. That kind of backlash we have seen from just measuring attitudes and things like that. But in terms of just racial animus, I don't know yet. It doesn't seem like it. But
Well, I mean, that's the example, is affirmative action, which the backlash to affirmative action has been going on for a long time. It might be more intense and it erupts every once in a while on the academic side, in the university setting. But and in the corporate setting as well. But do you anticipate that if this wokeism and anti-racism and whatever you want to call it continues, that there will be a similar eruption in unintended consequences of the anti-racists create racism?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Let's hope not. We don't want that that to happen either. And I don't know. It might be too soon to tell.
It's plausible, but I would say one of the most heartening things is actually seeing minorities actually speak out about this, right? Like, so like in Virginia, they characterize all the parents as being like white parents upset about Republicans. It wasn't. We have fair chapters there. I know it wasn't just Republicans. I know, and there were many actually Asian and South Asian parents who were also in the audience and who were also very concerned because this affects their kids.
And the African American.
And many,
Yeah.
and you've seen these videos go viral, African American parents standing up. We have one actually that FAIR supported that was suing the state of Nevada because her child was biracial.
Right.
So I think it depends on that a lot to prevent this, from kind of cleaving into a racial war. Okay, I guess one, yeah, last two really quick. Okay.
First, I want to applaud your efforts and involvement with the University of Austin to sort of restore balance back to the force, so to speak, ideological.
Although I have, truth be told, I have resigned from the Board of Advisors at the University of Austin. Okay. But,
well, okay, so it's interesting then because I was listening to Niall Ferguson on Lex Friedman's podcast talking about how different the culture was when he was at Oxford, and him and Andrew Sullivan, and how campuses are places for open thought and open discussion, and even to explore wrong thoughts and make mistakes. And I wonder, how has the climate changed so drastically from that time without there being sufficient pushback from professors, from intellectuals, people that devote their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, to where there's only essentially one point of view that's accepted? How did things get this far out of whack?
yeah, so some of the, again, it's a good question, and it's, I don't think we know the answer, and I don't think in universities it's as, well, it depends on the university, depends on the school, depends on the department. There are a lot of people in universities who are still, especially if they have tenure, who are voicing disagreement in various formats. I don't think universities are quite as far gone as the University of Austin manifesto made it out to be. But the spiral of silence, that is the fear of being denounced if you don't denounce first, is part of the dynamic. The fact that the ideas have been present, going back to the increasing influence of critical theory, starting probably in the 60s and 70s. The fact that institutions, including universities, do tend to drift leftward. Universities probably in advance of other institutions, but in turn influencing the other institutions. So I don't think we understand it completely why it seems to have accelerated in particular in the last few years, and why universities of all places, which ought to be crucibles for constructive disagreement, voicing of alternative opinions, this is one of the messages of my book Rationality, is that a lot of the rational accomplishments that we can be most proud of in the history of our species are not the brainchildren of just sole geniuses, but come from communities that follow tacit or sometimes explicit rules of open debate and criticism. Because even though all of us are susceptible to various biases and fallacies and flaws and blunders, we're pretty good at spotting other people's fallacies and biases and blunders. That's perhaps our saving grace, so that when you do have people in arenas of open inquiry and debate and criticism, then there's some hope that the truth can win. And when we disable that mechanism, when there's certain ideas that you just can't say, then we're guaranteed to perpetuate our ignorance, because no one is born knowing the truth. It's only by trying out ideas and evaluating them that we have any hope of increasing our knowledge. So it's particularly ironic, indeed tragic, that universities seem to be going in the direction of restricting the range of debatable ideas.
Good evening, Dr. Pinker. Lance Siegel. Hi. We met a few years ago at the Boston Book Festival. I'm not sure if you remember, but it's a pleasure seeing you again. So when it comes to rationality, I feel like one aspect of it is very kind of internalized. So it's based on basic exposure to your social surroundings, and also cognitive imprinting based on your family, friends, media, your education. And so my question is, right now what's popular in the mainstream and culturally is basically this groupthink, this intersectionality, as opposed to looking at the individual and individuality. How do we fight back? I mean, FAIR's doing it, I think University of Austin has some powers doing it, but how do we fight back and go back from where we were, kind of looking at, like the Founding Fathers, looking at individuality, and fight back against this kind of mainstream ideology where it's now popular to think in this groupthink and intersectionality? How do we fight back and take control back?
Well, some of it is to take advantage of some of the built-in advantages of classical liberalism, that people are not essentialized into groups and told what they have to think, that ideas are evaluated and people on their merits, and this is almost by definition the antithesis of racism, at least by the classic definition of racism. The fact that anyone making an argument for anything has already tacitly committed themselves to reason and rationality. They're saying, well, what I'm just saying is rational. You ought to believe it, and that is, you can be a point of common ground. If they're saying, well, I have good reasons for my belief, well, they've already signed on to reason. If there is both courage of individual naked emperor spotters, but some backup, some posse, someone having your back so that you're not the only one, and there I do think that FAIR has an important role to play in assuring people that they're not the only ones they're not crazy, but the world is crazy. Puncturing the spiral of silence.
I feel like a lot of people are just kind of fearful to fight back because it's not popular, it's not in the mainstream, that's why they stay silent. Unless if I don't see one person and they kind of join in, basically. But
well, the thing is that it's not even clear that it's mainstream, in that it's certainly public.
In the modern culture, like basically in popular culture in society right now, like basically people who have who have the voices, basically, who actually go with like this group things, intersectionality, basically that's the one that perpetuate this kind of ideology. Yeah, there are, especially in academia as well.
Yes, ironically, it is powerful elites that are kind of forcing this position on masses who often resist it. And it's actually not clear how mainstream a view it is, as opposed to mainstream among people who have a stranglehold on.
It's very like 10% basically people actually think this way.
Which itself mainstream, yeah. Which itself is a tactic that can be employed to the extent that popular opinion can be mobilized to push back. I think it's essential to avoid allowing it to be kind of politicized or turned into a right-wing issue. There's no reason that it should be, and then that, given the my-side bias, one of the most pervasive cognitive biases, the fact that people do tend to divide themselves into sides, that seems to have been increasing, the negative polarization, to try to avoid what I think is a trap of making free speech, open inquiry, individual rights, and so on, to allow it to be branded as right-wing is, I think, a losing tactic. Just because there are factions on the left that are opposed to it, but there are factions of the left, classical free speech liberalism, which came out of the Berkeley free speech movement in the 1960s, was a strongly left-wing movement. And it would be a big mistake to let these principles be branded as right-wing issues.
Just one last question before we wrap up.
I want to thank you both for coming here this evening. It means a lot to everyone here, so thank you both profusely. My question is, do you think things will get worse before they get better? And do you think that the only hope is for some semblance of normalcy is a different long march through the institutions, one that values rationality and Enlightenment values?
Yeah, it's so hard to tell because social phenomena political movements can have a kind of boom or bust dynamic to them. I don't think it's going away quickly, to be honest. But things can change. I do remember when I was a college student, there were pretty strong strains of political extremism, intolerance. A lot of people were Maoists. Quite literally. I had teachers who said we now have a utopia in the People's Republic of China. This was while the Cultural Revolution was still going on. I do remember students at a card table for the Democratic Socialist Workers Labor Union, or maybe it was the Democratic Labor Socialist Workers Union, their arch enemies, I forget which. Exactly, yes, that's right. The Judean People's Liberation Front, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea, from Monty Python's The Life of Brian. But I remember one of them, I remember a screaming match, and the person behind the card table saying, "Fascists do not have the right to speak." So a lot of these things are not new, and it did get better. I think the 90s were probably a more liberal period in the early 2000s. I've sometimes wondered, are movements that are spearheaded by leftist intellectuals inevitable? Is resistance futile, or can it suddenly melt away? There are cases where the left really has overplayed its hand, and one example is that in the 60s and 70s there was a movement spearheaded by French intellectuals, but not just French, to lower the age of sexual consent. That it was archaic to make sex with a 14-year-old a crime, that they were, just as the voting age was being lowered. And at the time, one could have thought, "Oh, geez, is this inevitable? Is this Jean-Paul Sartre was in favor of it, and Derrida, and all these fancy schmancy, very influential intellectuals?" But that collapsed, needless to say. And a good thing. So it is possible that some popular movements that at the time seemed to have a momentum and maybe even an inevitability to them can collapse.
Hello. So I promise my question is going to be very short. So there are some things that cannot wait till the pendulum swings back, and I mean the science and mathematics education, which is directly related to the defense capabilities of the country. And my main concern is abolishing of the standardized tests and abolishing of the specialized schools for science and mathematics. And can you see any temporary solutions to that? Because this is something that cannot wait till everything comes back.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and Melissa has spoken out about this, how China is now laughing their ass off at us, that they don't have that same kind of squeamishness, and we seem to be disabling the mechanisms that will nurture the next generation of achievers. It is it's a process that's again been a long time happening, because I lived through when I was in high school. And again, this was not recently. In the middle of my high school, there was an abandonment of streaming in my public high schools in Canada. And I know my quality of life went down because then I was suddenly thrown together with a lot of kids who would rather just clown around than listen to the teacher, and they had to be taught to a lower level. And so I don't know what would slow this down, whether it's the specter of competition with China as a kind of Sputnik wake-up call, whether that will change people's minds. Probably not. but it's a possibility.
I wonder if this is a taboo trade-off situation where
I suspect it is.
Where China's optimizing obviously for excellence, we're optimizing for, I don't know, diversity or something, and it is a trade-off, for example, but it's uncomfortable to talk about it, and so we can't even have a conversation.
I think that's right. I think that's part of it's the meta problem, that the conversation is very difficult to have.
Yep.
I mean, there is a certain pushback from, in the same way that the push toward meritocracy was often pushed by Jewish communities, because they were not connected to the old boys club, and standardized tests were their best friends, and we're seeing that replicated now often in Asian American families, as in the lawsuit against the institution that we're all familiar with in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It might go to the Supreme Court, and if it does, there could be some surprises there. But I don't know how to push back, because a lot of it does require wandering into some taboo territories. Yeah.
Thank you. I know I've kept you guys, for especially Dr. Pinker, long enough, but thank you. I think we got everybody's questions answered. I'll hand you back to Chris.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Doctor. Guys, we've got some food over around the corner. Jeff's going to open up the bar if anybody wants to have a couple drinks. We got to compete with the bocce players downstairs, so let's raise the roof. Thank you very much.